Hey, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all having a great day. My name's JBO and this is my 1992 Toyota MR2. So where I left off, I had just finished getting basically everything stripped off of the engine block. Since the last episode, I've actually spent a bit of time cleaning up all the stuff and getting it all prepped to go back on the engine. I'll just give you a quick look at the car as she's sitting now. I really miss driving this thing and I just really want to get this engine done and put back into her so I can get her ripping back on the streets again. But here you can see all the parts that I've gone ahead and started cleaning up. I've gone and started cleaning up all the oil lines, the oil pump, the rotor and the housing, the oil cooler mounting plate, baffle, oil pickup. I even started getting a brass wire wheel to the sort of thermostat coolant neck as well to clean that up. But yeah, I just want everything to be all nice and stuff and I'll put it back on the engine, which is just over here. Got a pretty cool episode today. Hopefully it turns out pretty cool. We're going to go ahead and install some ARP head studs. So to install these head studs today, I'm going to have to get into the engine, take the valve cover off, pull out the factory head bolts, pull the head, and then chuck the new studs in. So my reasoning for sort of going with ARP head studs now is that because I have the engine out, ideally I want to change the head gasket as well. But in doing so, I will have to replace the factory head bolts. The factory head bolts are torque to yield, which means that after torquing them to spec, you give it a bit of a 90-degree turn, I guess, to snug it down, and what that does is it stretches the bolt out and keeps the head fixed to the block. Basically, that means it's a one-time use only, and replacing them with ARP head studs means they're not torque to yield, so you don't have to replace them every time. Once they're torqued to spec, they don't stretch. If the head ever comes off again, you can just reuse the same studs over and over again, I guess. And in the long run, because you don't have to keep replacing the factory head bolts every time you take the head off, the ARP studs are a bit of a more cost-effective solution, I guess. Also, because this is a boosted engine, it will encounter a lot of sort of pressure build-up in the cylinders and in the head as well. And the ARP head studs will help sort of prevent any head lift that might occur in the engine, which I don't expect will happen at my power level, but it is a good sort of precautionary measure to have. It'll stop the head from lifting up off the block and giving you overheating issues, cooling issues, and it'll stop the head from warping as well. And speaking of head lift, I'll just show you the head gasket I'm replacing it with, which is over here. So this is a factory Gen 2 3S GTE head gasket. It is made of a graphite compound, which is different compared to the Gen 3 3S GTE head gasket, which is a multi-layer steel type. The reason I'm staying with this one is because of the fact that it is a graphite compound, and what this means is that it should absorb any sort of small or slight imperfections between the mating surfaces of the head and the block. This head gasket is also pretty well documented and proven to hold up well into the 300 to 400 horsepower range. There's been a lot of engineering and R&D that's gone into this by Toyota, and it is a pretty reliable head gasket, and I don't think I'll be hitting the power level anytime soon where I should blow out this head gasket. I don't really thrash my car or drive it super hard, so I think this will be perfect for me as well. I would also say that it's probably not as great as the Gen 3 MLS head gasket, but for what I'm looking for and what I'm needing, this should be sufficient, I guess. And just before we get into it, I'll just show you some of the sort of tools that you're probably going to need to do a job like this. To start, you're going to need a triple square-headed bit like this. It looks kind of like a Torx head, but it's not. I've just got it on a long extension here because the factory head bolts can be a bit of a pain to remove with the cam still in place. You're also going to need a 10 by 1.25 metric fine thread tapper. This is just so you can chase out the thread holes in the block so that the studs go in pretty nicely. You're also going to need a 12mm multi-sided socket for the ARP nuts here. I've also got two Allen keys here. One is for snugging up the studs because they have a hex head on the top of them. The other one is for removing the stainless cap screws I've got around the valve cover. Most likely your engine will come with some Phillips head bolts holding this on, but a common upgrade is to swap them out for stainless cap screws, as the Phillips ones have a tendency to strip if you take them out too much. And last but not least, we've got the ARP head studs here. You do get 10 in a kit, so you get 10 studs, 10 washers and 10 nuts. You're also supplied with some ARP lubricant. You ideally want to use this when installing these head studs. You don't want to be using any sort of motor oil or anything like that. You just do what ARP recommends. You also do get some instructions that have the torque settings and steps to install them as well. And ideally you also want to have the BGB or the Toyota repair manual handy, because that will give you the sort of the order to remove the studs and reinstall them as well, which we'll go into later on. So I'll just put you down and we'll get straight into it. Cool, so I don't know how well you can see right now, but I've just got the camera propped up on the bench behind me just so you guys can get a good view of what's going on. But I'm going to start by removing the 10 stainless cap screws with this Allen key here, just to take the valve cover off, and that'll show me where the OEM head bolts are located, and then I can get started on pulling those out. So this is what it looks like under the valve cover. It is a bit messy in here. There's a lot of sort of oily gunk and dried oil up in here. But for the most part, everything looks pretty clean. There's no sort of scoring or anything on the cam lobes around here, which is always a good sign. I can also see the 10 OEM head bolts sitting in there. So this is where I would get out full square-headed socket bit here. So when you're removing the OEM head bolts, you want to follow the manufacturer specific sequence for removing them. This is just to stop the head from warping or twisting. In this case, to remove this head, you'll have to start from the first bolt, which is here, over to 2 by the distributor, 3, 4, 5, 6, then I believe it's 7, 8, 9, and then 10. Also that fits there on there pretty good. So I'm just going to go ahead and start removing all of these.
Perfect.
Awesome, so we finally got the head off, and honestly, the head gasket looks a lot better than I expected it would. It seems to be in pretty good shape. There doesn't seem to be any sort of blowouts or anything around there, which I expected because the car never really had any overheating issues. But the gasket itself doesn't look too bad. I mean, the car does have pretty low Ks. You can still see the honing marks inside the cylinders as well, which is good. Which sort of goes to show that the cylinder and the rings are probably not that worn either. It is a bit gunky, but I'll go ahead and take the gasket off and then start cleaning this up. But yeah, no, I'm really pleased with that. From what I can tell, it looks like a couple of the coolant ports have started to get a bit gummed up with some of the head gasket material, I guess, over the last sort of 30 years. As you can see, probably around here and here and here, some of the holes seem to have started to get blocked off, I guess, but with the new head gasket, all these holes will sort of be opened up a bit more, which is good. Right, so it's actually been a couple of days since the last clip where I pulled the head off the engine. Since then, I've actually just spent a lot of the time cleaning up the surfaces of the block and the head. There was a lot of carbon buildup and a lot of head gasket gunk still left on the head and the block after I took it off. So I'll just show you what I've done to clean it up. So this is the block as it is now. Basically, I just went over it really carefully with this tool here. It's kind of like a little handle with a razor blade in it. And what I did was I just slowly went around the block. I filled in each of the holes to make sure gunk wouldn't fall in, but I went around the block really slowly and just gradually scraped off all the gunk. I can now run my hand over it and I don't feel any sort of variation in the surface texture of the block. I have taken a straight edge across different angles of the block to make sure that there's no sort of unevenness or, you know, to make sure that the surface is quite flat, I guess. And that's sort of just to ensure that the head gasket sits really flat against the block when the head is on top of it. You want it to be as straight as possible so that there's no sort of issues with cooling or overheating when the engine's running again. I've also taken a Scotch-Brite to the tops of each pistons just to remove a lot of the carbon buildup. These are pretty black when I pulled the head off. I haven't managed to get rid of all of it, so I might have a crack at getting some more off later on. And I'll just quickly show you what I've done to the head, which is over here. I pretty much gave it the same sort of treatment as I did with the block. I went over it with the razor blade really carefully after I filled in all these holes, really carefully just to clean up as much of the gunk as possible. I can sort of run my hand across the surface now and I don't feel any variation in the texture as I did with the block. And if I run my nail, it doesn't seem to catch on anything. But when you're doing this sort of work with a stainless steel blade like this on aluminium, you want to be really careful not to sort of nick the metal. If stainless steel catches aluminium, it can make a lot of nicks and gouges, which you don't really want. You want to kind of avoid that as best as possible. I've also gone ahead and taken a straight edge like I did with the block, just to make sure it's as straight and as flat as I can possibly make it, just so it seats really nice against the block. I guess I just sort of have to have some faith in myself, I suppose, but I imagine that with the head gasket and the intense clamping force that the ARP studs are going to have on the head and the block, I don't think I should run into any issues, but I guess I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. But yeah, so next up I'm probably going to go ahead and start chasing up the threads of the block with this 10 by 1.25 metric fine thread chaser. This is just to sort of clean up the threads and ensure that the head studs thread in nicely and seat properly. This is just so that there's an even clamping force across the whole surface of the block and the head as well. You sort of just want to thread it in as much as you can, and when it starts to get tight you just want to back it off a little bit. This is just to clean out any of the gunk that might be in the threads, and then just sort of keep threading it back down again until it sort of bottoms out, I guess. You want to do that for each of the holes, and then once that's done you sort of want to get a air compressor and just blow out all of the holes just to get any residual gunk and stuff out of there, and then we can start getting on to threading some of these ARP studs in and then getting the head onto the block.
Perfect!
So what you want to do is you want to put a really small amount of ARP lubricant that's supplied in the kit on the bottom threads, which is on the opposite end of the side that has the hex head on top. And you just want to thread it in by hand, and then you just snug it down with the Allen key so it bottoms out, and then back it off just a tiny amount, okay? And you want to go around and you want to do that for each of the bolt holes. Cool, so all the studs are installed. I put lubricant on all the threads on the bottom, screwed them in, and then I basically tightened them down to just snug inside the block with the Allen key. And I'm just going to clean off any of the excess that's sitting around the block here and on the shafts of the studs. This is just to make sure that there's no sort of build up or anything under the head gasket when we put it on. Now before you go ahead and put your head gasket on, you just want to make sure that it's the right way up and it's also pointing the right way. In this case, this 3S GTE head gasket has an arrow pointing forward, so towards the front of the engine. You can tell which way it goes because these three sort of big holes here where the arrow is line up to these three sort of big galleries on the back of the engine there. So I'll just slide that over the top. And you just sort of want to guide it into place. You don't want to force it or anything, just let it fall freely until it sits nicely on the engine block like that. And then we'll get started on getting the head on. So I finally got the head onto the block and it slid on pretty nicely. I'll just quickly show you what I had to do to get it done. You want to do it slowly just so the studs don't impact or scratch on anything. You want it to slide on really nicely, and it did come through pretty good, and you can see them all poking up in between the cams and stuff there. But next up will be to do the washers and the nuts, which I'll just show you over here. So basically the deal with these washers is you want to be pretty liberal when you're applying the lubricant to them. You want it to be lubricated on both sides, I guess. The washer probably receives the most amount of friction and force when the nuts are being tightened down, and basically having lubricant on both sides of the washer will mean that the nut can turn freely on the washer, and the washer won't the washer will just turn nicely on the aluminium. It won't like dig in or sort of damage the aluminium in any way. And the same goes for the nuts. You want to sort of put some lubricant on the inner threads of these nuts as well as on the tops of the studs in there. That's just so that the nut threads on nicely and there's no sort of binding or any sort of unnecessary friction against the components, I guess. And when you're tightening them down, you want to go with the OEM manufacturer's recommendations for the torque sequence, which is right here. You want to follow that sequence, but you want to go to ARP's recommendation for torque setting when you're doing the head studs, which in this case is 60 foot-pounds. It recommends that you do the torque sequence in 3 stages. So I'll probably do the first pass on all the head studs in the factory sequence to 20 foot-pounds of torque, then I'll go up to 40 foot-pounds of torque, and then I'll do a final torque of 60 foot-pounds to get the final sort of reading across all the head studs there. Finally got the head back onto the engine. It honestly feels so good to have this head back on the engine because it means I can start putting everything back together, and that pretty much means that's like the main job out of the way, which means I'm pretty much one big step closer to getting the engine put back in the car. I did run into an issue or two while I was tightening everything down though. If you saw in the clip, I actually had to go ahead and take out the intake cam because I couldn't actually get the socket to sit down on this nut down right here, which I expected might happen because I also couldn't get the OEM head bolt out while this cam was still in place. So I went ahead and took the cam out, which is over here, and that gave me enough clearance to get the socket on to tighten everything down. So I went around and I did a pass of 20 foot-pounds, 40 foot-pounds, and then 60 foot-pounds. I didn't have to modify my socket. It turned out to have just enough clearance to get a good enough grip on the nut so I could tighten it all down, which I expected might happen because I also couldn't get the OEM head bolt out while this cam was still in place. So I went ahead and took the cam out, which is over here, and that gave me enough clearance to get the socket on to tighten everything down. So I went around and I did a pass of 20 foot-pounds, 40 foot-pounds, and then 60 foot-pounds. I didn't have to modify my socket. It turned out to have just enough clearance to get a good enough grip on the nut so I could tighten it all down. But yeah, so that's the biggest job out of the way, and I'm really stoked with that. Now I can start putting the valve cover back on. I can start attaching all these coolant lines, the oil pump, the housing, baffle. I can put everything back on now, and we can start working towards getting this engine back into the car, and I honestly can't wait. But yeah, it is pretty late, and that's probably going to be it for the night. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's probably going to be a bit of a longer one, but I'm not too sure. I haven't really edited it yet, obviously. I did learn a lot doing this job. I'd never even pulled a head off, let alone do a head gasket, and I managed to kick all those out in the last few days. But yeah, I'm really stoked with the progress I'm making now. I can start putting it all back together, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you guys learned something. Maybe you want to give it a try on your own engine one time. But let me know what you thought of the video. Let me know what you want to see from me. But until next time, I'll see you guys later. Peace.